We have 4 items on the agenda. Item number 1 is a Quindle Terminals update.
We have no signal here. Good evening, council members, Councilmember President Ed Prince, Vanessa Dolby, current planning manager from CED. I'm just going to introduce the 3 folks I have here from the EPA to do the presentation. Other than that, I'm out of the way. And actually, Kathy is going to be the only one that's doing the presentation. Kathy Cerise is the project manager for the Quindle Terminals site for the cleanup. And I'm going to open up your presentation for you and hand it in. There are some fact sheets in the back, too.
Okay, let's hope I can be bright enough to get this a slideshow. There is no guarantees. Maybe from beginning, that's always a good start. So I wanted to come talk to everybody today, just give you an update on the Quindle Terminal site, because we are now finally moving much closer to cleanup, and we're getting ready to put out the proposed plan. This is a map, I'm sure you all know it, of the site. It's a 51-acre site. 23 acres is upland, 28 acres is water, in the water. As you know, the site is currently undeveloped. It's bordered by the Seahawks facility and Connor Homes. It has 1,500 feet of Lake Washington shoreline, and Burlington Northern has a right-of-way to the east. The site history is from 1916 to 1969. Creosote was manufactured. The coal tar residues were distilled and shipped off the site or transported to J.H. Baxter next door. From 1969 to 1983, the crude oil, waste oil, and diesel was stored. And then from 75 to 2009, it was used for log sorting and storage. As you also probably know, the site is currently vacant and fenced to prevent public access. There are 2 operable units in the 53-acre sites, and this is only relevant because there's going to be 2 proposed plans. And so there'll be 1 proposed plan for the upland, which we call OU1, and 1 for what we call OU2, the in-water. And part of the reason we split this into 2 operable units is that we thought perhaps we would need the upland portion to move faster to provide opportunity for the development, but it really looks like they're going to come out at the same time in parallel, which of course means you get to read 2 at the same time. So the contaminants are concentrated, dense, non-aqueous phase liquid. They leach from what's called DNAPL into groundwater, which flows into Lake Washington. Keep wanting to click that one. A brief summary of what EPA has been doing on the site. In 1988, the initial site work was ordered. 2006, it was added to the Superfund NPL site. In 2012, the site investigation was completed. 2014, the site-wide remedy was presented to the EPA National Remedy Review Board. So that's kind of our secondary level to review what we're proposing and see if they have any concerns or agree with our approach. In 2016, we completed the evaluation of cleanup alternatives. And in 2017, EPA reevaluated Upland's in situ treatment technology and decided to add a technology called STAR, which I'll walk through a little in a future slide. And this fall, we completed the STAR treatability study. And just for clarification, I actually have to read it because it's so long. STAR stands for Self-Sustaining Technology for Active Remediation. So, I am sure you're all aware of the potential redevelopment. So it's over the 23 acres. Obviously, it has incredible opportunities because it is one of the last undeveloped large parcels. Our understanding that their current permit includes 700 units of multifamily housing and 30,000 square feet of retail and restaurant space. Good, glad we got that one right, because we've been telling people that. So BOSA Development Projects, LLC, has signed a purchase agreement to buy and redevelop the Quindle Terminals property. So we were notified of that about a week ago. So this slide shows the remedies so it's basically the cleanup options that we're proposing. In operable unit 1, which is the uplands, the developable portion, we're looking at proposing in situ solidification and some combination of those two, and a permeable sand cap. In what we're calling operable unit 2, which is the sediments in lake, it'll be a combination of dredging and a sand cap, and then in the over what was dredged to protect against the upwelling contaminated groundwater, and then a thin layer capping in the remaining sediment areas. And when we put forward the feasibility study and the proposed plan, we looked at 10 different alternatives. Luckily, we're not going to go through all those. And so I'm just going to highlight 2 of them for reference for you. So alternative 4A is the preferred alternative by the responsible parties, potentially responsible parties. And that's a combination of DNAPL collection trenches requiring off-site disposal, a permeable reactive barrier, and then in situ stabilization at 2 locations that have sources. And the total amount of soil that would be treated would be 17,500 cubic yards. And then they'd have an engineered sand cap. This alternative would have minimal impact on toxicity, mobility, or volume. It's expected to have about a 10% reduction, 10% reduction in upland DNAPL, and 60% of the sediment in the lake would be treated. The EPA's preferred alternative that will be put forth in the proposed plan is 7A, which is likely a combination of ISS, which is in situ stabilization, and this STAR, the self-sustained combustion. In that upland DNAPL, it will address all principal threat waste, and that will address 241,000 cubic yards versus the responsible parties of 17. It will dredge sediment DNAPL, which is 58,000 cubic yards, and we will have an engineered sand cap. It treats 100% of the DNAPL sources, and our expected mass reduction in groundwater is between 98 and 100%. So here's a little graphic of the preferred alternative for 7A. And it's a combination of the self-sustained technology for active remediation, STAR, and in situ solidification. I think it has a higher protectiveness of the first 7 alternatives, and it's probably more, we believe it's more timely and economical than alternatives 8 through 10. So,
Go ahead, Randy.
Can you go back to that graphic and
that
the
first
previous?
guys, back, how's back? Thank you.
I don't want to put you on the spot.
Absolutely.
I don't know how much you know about these, but I was just trying to understand on the pictures on the left and the right. Are both of those on the upland part, or is one
It's
of them?
both on the upland. So the one on the left would be STAR, so that shows the self-sustained combustion, which happens below ground.
Okay.
And the picture beside it is the in situ stabilization, which is basically an amendment that's mixed with basically like a concrete, mixed into the soil that solidifies the contaminant and the soil in that matrix, so that
Okay.
the contaminants are no longer mobile.
Oh, okay. And again, and I know your other chart said this, but I'm just trying
Yeah.
to keep up. Would a combination of both of these be used? Is that what's being proposed?
That's what we're currently evaluating. We're getting our final report middle of October.
Okay.
And so we'll be looking at the balance of STAR and ISS. So there may be certain locations where ISS makes more sense, certain
Okay.
locations where STAR, and we can't finalize that until we get all the
Okay.
results back. And then Savron, who is the proprietor of this technology, lays out kind of how could you optimize it.
Okay. And then, do you also have a graphic in here of the underwater treatment, or?
There's not an underwater treatment. So in the water, you would be dredging. So you put in, this word always leaves me. It's not, it's the wall, but it's a temporary wall.
like a containment wall? or
Yeah,
something?
it's like a
Barrier?
containment wall. There's a great word for it, but it's not in my head right now. So we put up a wall to keep from impacting the rest of the lake. Then they dredge and to the
So it's soil
defined
removal,
depth.
basically? and-
Right, and then they set a geomembrane down and put, I believe it's a 3-foot
Oh, okay.
cap above it.
Oh, that's a great explanation. Okay, yeah,
Okay.
thanks. Okay.
So this is a little bit on the technology. STAR is a thermal oxidation process that results in the destruction of the target contaminant through a smoldering combustion reaction. The net products of the thermal oxidation are carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, water, and heat. So you have clean soil. And it's this combination of 3 inputs. It's first your fuel source that's there, which is your DNAPL. Then you're injecting air and heat. And then it makes the self-sustained combustion. It's very easy to control this reaction because all you have to do is remove either the heat or the air and the combustion stops. And we piloted it this summer and it appears to be very effective.
Wow.
So we did first you did a lab column test to look if this material could achieve self-sustained combustion and what kind of reductions we would get. And the bench scale showed that we would have a 99% reduction in what we call TPH, total petroleum hydrocarbons. So the pre-TPH value was 95,000 milligrams per kilogram, and the post was 160 milligrams per kilogram. And on your left, you show the pre-treated sand, and the right is the post.
Wow.
So we believe that 7A is the best choice for operable Unit 1. It treats all the upland principal threat waste. It incorporates the innovative STAR technology and an ISS where appropriate. Allows for the site to be real developed sooner and with fewer restrictions by adding STAR. Implementations will be developed, as I said, once we get the final results of that report in mid-October. And it also doesn't have the potential hydrologic impacts that you'd have with ISS.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, can you tell us about this picture that we're looking at here?
That's just a site picture that they were doing some early digging to find good locations to, this particular one to collect their bench scale. And so it shows a mixture of the water and the creosote in a pit.
Okay,
So
that's,
it kind of drives back, the question of is there any creosote? Yeah, there's creosote.
and is the like gray soil on top of that, is that also contaminated? Or is it just mud?
It just really depends. Since I'm looking at a pretty high level, I mean, of this picture, generally, the first foot is not contaminated. The highest amounts of contamination, generally, we see about 16 feet. And we tend to see the end of the contamination between 25 and 30 feet.
Okay, wow.
And part of that's because you've got a pretty nice solid clay layer, and then you have some intermittent layers that are like silt with some clay and sand, and we actually effectively were able to show that we could jump some of those layers during the STAR, because that's your ideal, right? That you can
Yeah.
get each one of those sand layers and ultimately get it cleaned up down to that clay layer.
Great, thanks.
Sure. So the potential impacts to residents from the cleanup, light to moderate noise, odors, visual impact. And again, when we did STAR, we tested both, we had no complaints, and really you couldn't hear anything past where we were doing the operation. It's pretty quiet. With STAR, we haven't seen an odor problem. ISS can have a little more of an odor problem. There may be a slight increase in traffic from the work crews. And lastly, EPA is committed to being a good neighbor and will take whatever steps needed to limit the impacts to the community. So we finished the STAR pilot midsummer. We'll have the results mid-October. We're planning to release the proposed plan for both Operable Unit 1 and Operable Unit 2 on November 1st. We plan to have a public meeting. Right now, we're looking at November 15th, and I'm not positive we found a location, so we're looking. We're talking to Seahawks, see if they want to let us play on their property. And then the records of decision are expected in the summer of 2019. And that's all I have for you, unless you have any questions.
Any,
Yeah.
go ahead.
I just have a curiosity question.
Absolutely.
When you're burning the stuff and you get to clean the sand, doesn't
Yes.
that dry that sand out so the ground will become lower?
No, because during the process, the air blows the water out, so the combustion is effective, but as soon as you're not running either the air or the heat, that reaction stops and the water comes right back in, because you're
okay.
saturated quite high in that area. Actually, I remember walking through it in the spring, and you had about a foot above ground.
Any other questions from council? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, up next, we have the I-405 Renton to Bellevue Widening Express Toll Lanes Program Update.
Daryl Keys?
Yeah, I'll just use keys. Thanks. Good evening, everyone. I'm Kim Henry. I'm with Washington State Department of Transportation in the 405167 program. And I'd just like to start off by saying thanks for having me here to give an update on the program. I think it was just last Friday, Councilmember Corman gave a very good update on what was going on. So some of this might not be too new, but I think we also have some very interesting things going on here that I just wanted to share with everybody. And this is a slide I think everybody has seen many times, and I'd just like to remind everybody that we do have a multimodal, multi-agency program, and that we are continuing to make a lot of progress on that and working with our partners, and I'm going to touch on a couple of things we've been doing with our partners. The next phase that we are working on with the corridor program here is the completion of the express toll lane system. This set of projects that we're working on to complete the project or to complete the express toll lanes will not finish the master plan. We still have many more projects beyond that. But once we complete the next set of projects, we'll be connecting up the 167 hot lanes into the express toll lanes that run from Bellevue and to the north. And so that will really change the operations of the corridor once we have that 40-mile system in place. One of the major components of the Renton to Bellevue project that was funded by the state legislature in 2015 is the 405-167 interchange project. That project is actually moving ahead of schedule right now, so we're very pleased with the progress that's been going on out there. We just recently had a closure in August 17th and through the 20th on the weekend to get a lot of work done. We have another closure scheduled for this upcoming weekend. It's a full closure of Highway 167 to finish some important work there. And those two closures are really then going to set the stage for the last phases of work. I want to just show a short video of the work that was done the first weekend. And this will show what was actually happening out there while closure was in place. So we really try to keep the roadway open while we're doing work out there and keep traffic flowing, but as you can see, there's a lot of activity that had to happen in that short amount of time. This is where the traffic is actually traveling, and so the most efficient way is to actually just do the closure and get that work complete. For the upcoming closure that we have, it's fish passage work. We've got a big culvert that's going in under the southbound roadway, and we'll combine a whole bunch of paving work at the same time. And so once again, we'll be able to use that time and get as much work accomplished as possible. So the next phase of our project is the widening piece between Highway 167 and downtown Bellevue. Overall, that's a very sizable contract. Our upset price on this contract is $710 million, and it is a single construction contract. We did that specifically to have the contractor really make sure we have well-coordinated traffic control throughout the life of the project. Since we have so much congestion through here, keeping the traffic moving is going to be a very important piece of this. But as we looked at this from an environmental perspective, we actually broke it up into two different study areas. So we did environmental assessment of the work from I-90 and to the north through downtown Bellevue. That work is complete. And we are nearly complete with the work then from I-5 at Tukwila up through I-90 area. So we're really, really close there. As part of this work, we're continuing to coordinate with our partners. So we'll be doing work for both Sound Transit and King County. But we're also partnering with the city on several projects throughout the city area. And so far, we're still on schedule to begin construction in 2019. I think I've shown this slide here before, but just a quick reminder that we do have added capacity that goes the entire length from 167 interchange all the way up into downtown Bellevue. That new capacity that we're building will be coupled with the HOV lane to create that dual express toll lane. And then in the southbound direction, you can see a couple of sections where we have some green lines there, and that represents an auxiliary lane. And so at the north end of the map going southbound there'll be an auxiliary lane coming from I-90 down through Coal Creek and to 112th. And so for anybody who drives that in the afternoon, you know that's just a terrible commute, all that I-90 traffic coming on there. And so this extra capacity for the extra distance down to 112th is really going to help smooth that particular area out. And then we also have an auxiliary lane from the 44th interchange up the hill to the 30th interchange. This is a look at the actual traffic model combined with our design at the 44th interchange, where we have an inline flyer stop that we've been working with Sound Transit on. And then we have a series of roundabouts instead of traffic signals. And with a roundabout, cars have the advantage of being able to go whenever there is a gap in traffic. And so we're looking at traffic in 2045, which actually is moving much better in 2045 than it is today. A couple different reasons for that. Part of it is the freeway is moving better, so we have fewer cut-through trips. People quit driving through neighborhoods to get all the way down to 44th. But also the roundabouts just really help keep traffic moving. And so overall, we're seeing a much better performance in that interchange area. We also will be doing some work through the S-curves once again, and we do need to replace the two bridges that go up to Renton Hill. And so we've been working with staff to make sure that we're doing that in a way that's going to minimize impacts. We're going to make sure that one of those structures is always open until we get the work done. So we'll be doing one structure, and then we get that built complete. We'll switch traffic over onto the new structure, and then we'll complete the second structure. We're also working with King County, and we'll be building about 2.5 miles of their trail on the East Side Rail Corridor. And so that will be stretching from about the 44th interchange all the way up past Coal Creek. We'll also be building a new bike and pedestrian overcrossing at the old Wilburton Tunnel site in order to continue that trail all the way into downtown Bellevue. I've shown congestion contours here a number of different times, and these are really some of that same information, but we actually added several different shades of green. And so green is the free flow condition, but the previous ones I was showing was just 45 miles an hour or better. So we broke that down into several additional speeds there, so you can see the different ranges of what's going on. And what we have in this particular contour set here is 2025 morning traffic. And so during that time period, on the left-hand side is without the project, and on the right-hand side is with the project. So in the morning, the predominant direction of travel is northbound. So as we're on the left-hand side looking at that northbound, that's what we would be seeing in 2025, which is not really that much different than what we see today. Just heavily congested in both the HOV lane and the general purpose lane, all the way up through the 44th interchange. And of course, it stretches throughout the entire morning period. So it's really a very, very difficult commute. Then if you go to the far right-hand side and look at that, that's with the project, northbound, and everything from Tukwila up through Renton has essentially disappeared here in terms of congestion. And so, but we do still have a few congestion points north of Renton as we approach I-90, and then also as we get into downtown Bellevue. Once again, as I mentioned earlier, we're still not done with the master plan, so we have projects that will come back and address those particular areas. This is the same thing in the afternoon commute, and so as you're on the left-hand side of the page and you're leaving Bellevue, it is a very, very difficult commute, and that stretches all the way down through 112th, and then it's hit and miss, stop and go from there on down. And so as you go to then the right-hand side of the page and look at the southbound direction, you can see that all of that congestion has disappeared. What we're seeing, though, is we've removed the bottleneck, and we've let a lot more traffic volume then travel the southbound direction, and it eventually arrives at I-5 interchange in Tukwila, where we are not adding any new capacity. And so you can see that particular area has gotten a little bit worse as a result of the additional volumes through there. Once again, we do have plans for improvements to that interchange, but they're not part of this particular project. As we continue to work with our partners over at Sound Transit, though, this is an area that's very, very concerning for us, because we would really like to make sure that we're getting the buses through that area and through that interchange as best we possibly can until a permanent project is in place.
Mr. Pavoni.
How do you, where does the data come for these graphics? Where's the compilation of the data come from?
So we get our population employment data from the Puget Sound Regional Council, and so we use that information as we start looking at the traffic volumes, and they also make forecasts. But then as we take those regional traffic volume forecasts, then we do micro simulation or several different runs of our traffic model to bring it into what the actual capacities are in and around the freeway, but also what are the capacities of roadways feeding into the freeway. So some of our highways won't be making additional capacity improvements. So I-5 doesn't really have anything on the books right now. 167 is not going beyond what's currently as part of this project. And so those things are actually somewhat metering the demand. So while we have a lot of regional growth going on, there's only so much traffic that can get through some of our arterials and freeways and actually get to 405. And so we go through a process to really fine-tune what those numbers look like, both in terms of 2025 and 2045.
All right.
This is our schedule for the next several years as we take a look at our Connecting Washington projects and moving those forward. The first three are all related to the Renton to Bellevue section, and so as I'd mentioned before, we're moving along very well on our interchange project, and so that's great news. As we look at the second line down, There's a yellow box there that we've made a commitment working with King County to get the regional trail open by the end of 2020, and so that's a milestone that we're working towards. And then as you go out to 2024 there's a dashed vertical line, and that's the timeline that Sound Transit plans to have their bus rapid transit online and operational. So we're trying to complete all of our projects that will be needing the infrastructure to be complete by that time frame. We continue to work with Sound Transit as they're updating their schedule a little bit, and so as they start to fine-tune that, and they're getting more detailed information all the time on that schedule as they continue to make progress, we'll adjust our schedules to really line up to be more consistent. During the last legislative session, Representative Cliburn asked for us to put together a map that would really help describe what's currently funded between both WashDOT and the Sound Transit, but also that would identify what are the next round of priority projects. And so we did that with the orange box and the orange parts on the map all being part of Connecting Washington. Then in the blue box, we have a couple of different inline freeway stations for transit that we're working on with Sound Transit. And so the one at 44th, which we just did the video of, and then also one in Kirkland at 85th. And then down at the bottom were the next round of priority projects. We've been having some performance problems up north in the Bothell area where we have a single lane express toll lane system, and we did not add any capacity up there. And so that's really a high priority project for us that we need to move forward. But we also have several different projects also on 167 with the hot lanes, excuse me, to make those really work and make this a seamless system without any of the problems we would have without the adjustments. And so we want this system to really be continuous as you go from one end of the system to the other end of the system. So those were the sets of projects, but there really wasn't any funding immediately set up for those. So Representative Cliburn also asked us to take a look at, could we bond against the toll revenue that we're generating in the express toll lanes to help fund those projects? So between the funds that we had and the funds that were needed for those projects, we needed $710 million, and we made a number of assumptions that none of the toll rates change anywhere from what they are today, and we then also took a look at triple-backed bonds at a 25-year level debt service. And as we went through that exercise, we looked at two different ways to fund those, and one was just based off 405 alone. And if we only looked at 405 as a revenue source, we could generate about $575.5 million, which was not quite enough. But if we combined 405 and 167 revenues together, then that gave us enough to really fund that entire project list. But in order to do that, there's a number of things that have to happen in the legislature. So one of them is toll authorization for the Renton to Bellevue segment. The state legislature gave us authority to go out and build express toll lanes, but they haven't actually given us authority to start collecting tolls yet. That's something that they need to do, and something they intend to do as far as we're all aware, but at this point they haven't gotten to that stage. Also, 167 is currently a pilot project. And so that needs to be converted over to a permanent hot lane facility in order for us to move forward with any type of bonding. Then also combine the two corridors together into a single corridor. And then also with bond authorization, they need to approve that and then give us approval for the final projects. These are questions that came from the legislature, and so this is something that we answered those questions back to the legislature. And at this point, if there's going to be any movement going forward with the bond authorization, that would be a legislative action. It's not something WashDOT's currently asking of the legislature. So as I'm wrapping up here, one of the things I did want to mention at the end here is that we do have an executive advisory group meeting coming up in the corridor that's going to be the second week of December, and it is going to be here in Renton, and so more information will be coming out on that one here fairly soon. And with that, any questions for me?
Any questions from council? Don?
Good to see you again, Kim. My questions are around the bridges, and obviously you already answered, are you going to take down one bridge at a time, which
Yes.
we've worked through before and we'll work through again. My understanding from what you said tonight is you most likely take the Renton Avenue Bridge down first, right?
Yes.
And that last I heard was scheduled for around like July of 2019, or is it going to be later than that?
Yeah, no, it will be later than that. And so when we go through the process with bringing a design builder on board, we'll ask them to provide their staging and construction schedule as part of that proposal to figure out what's the most efficient, cost-effective way for them to put the project together. And so that is something we won't know until we actually get their proposal in hand and select the winning bidder.
I guess kind of a big issue for at least two council people, me being one, is at the bottom of the hill, we have Renton Hill signs. And we have been promised when we built them that they would be removed and put back if they have to be moved. I just want to make a little reminder.
Okay?
And I think it'll go good. I'm very positive about this, and I think the community is. You know, obviously, when you go from two ways to get out of town to one for about a year or so, it'll be some difficult, but I'm sure we'll work through it.
We're very much concerned about impacts that's going to be happening up there, and when we put together our goals for the contractor, which we will score them against, one of them was minimizing impacts, and there's really a couple different kinds of impacts. One is the commuter impact and the driver on the freeway, but there's also the community impacts, and we know how important that is to be a good neighbor.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions from council? All right, thank you, Kim.
Thank you.
All right, next up is the King County Solid Waste Management Comprehensive Plan. Greg?
Good evening, President Prince and members of the council. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Pat McLaughlin. He's the Director of King County Solid Waste Division, and he's here today with an update on the 2019 Comprehensive Solid Waste Management Plan.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here this evening, and as mentioned, my name is Pat McLaughlin, and it's my honor to serve as the county's Solid Waste Division Director, and appreciate the partnership that we have with the City of Renton. It has allowed us to achieve, as you're going to hear this evening, some of the best recycling rates in the nation, and advance our goals both in terms of environmental and service excellence. And yet we find ourselves at a crossroad that I wanted to talk with you about this evening in terms of our long-term planning. Because as our region continues to grow and become more and more robust, we find that we've got to make some time-sensitive decisions to ensure that we can continue to be in the forefront of how we manage our waste and our resources. And yet, the guiding framework for such decisions is rather outdated. Our comprehensive plan was last updated in 2001, and yet we need to make some decisions today, and we need to really benefit from some updated guidance to ensure that the decisions reflect the priorities and needs of the region, and that's what I wanted to briefly cover with you this evening. And my plan is, I know you have a slide deck in front of you, maybe spend even less than 10 minutes kind of going through the slides and then allow for at least as much time to answer your questions and enter into any dialogue that would be helpful for you. The easy choices have already been made, however, so that's, I guess, the one caveat I have to put before you. I want to talk about 3 policy areas that are reflected in this comprehensive plan that is currently going through an adoption process. One is around disposal for the waste that is collected in this region. Secondly, around transfer services. And then third, recycling policies. But I'll begin with disposal because it actually represents really, I think, one of the biggest decisions in front of us. And to set the context for that discussion, I want to briefly cover what's driving the issues of disposal. Our tonnage forecast is continuing to grow. The graph that's before you reflects in the yellow line, the lowest line there, that has been our planning forecast. It was established back in 2016. It's been the basis of our current rate and our current activity plans. But over the last couple of years, we've continued to see growth in both population and in tonnage going through our system. And as we have considered and updated our forecast looking forward, we see that trend continuing to grow. Depending on how aggressive our assumptions are relative to ongoing population growth and even that of economic growth and recessions, we are seeing relatively significant tonnage increases. The blue line is kind of the middle of the road. That's our current planning assumption, our revised planning assumption, if you will, that we need to ensure our capacity, both through transfer services as well as the landfill, is prepared to support. I mentioned that our disposal choice is the most significant decision that's reflected in our comprehensive plan. The reason for that is largely because of timing. Now, with Renton and 36 other cities in King County, we're very fortunate to have an interlocal agreement whereby we have agreed to work as a region and have the benefit of a regional solid waste system. That puts the responsibility on King County, however, to do this planning, and a core expectation that you have of the county is to ensure that you've got a place for your garbage to go. And that has, for over 50 years, been the Cedar Hills Regional Landfill in Maple Valley. We run that landfill pretty well, and I just have to say as an aside, if you haven't had the chance to come out to that landfill, even in the last couple of years, if not ever, we would love to invite you out and tour you at that landfill. It is not, as they might say, it's not your daddy's landfill. It's quite an engineering wonder, and if nothing else, it's a wildlife preserve. We're wonderfully blessed to have elk and deer and foxes and all bald. You'll see more bald eagles than you will on an Alaskan cruise. And so it's an open invitation to see this engineering wonder, but it is going to reach its capacity in less than 10 years. That's not the first time you've heard that. If you've been around for even a short period of time, there's been revised estimates of when Cedar Hills is going to close. And, but I can tell you that based on the available capacity that we have, we are estimated that it will be filled up, if you will, within 10 years. 2028 is the current estimate. So the question is, what's next? And you know, what can we design and implement in less than 10 years? We have 3 basic choices. One is we could add one more cell at Cedar Hills. I think that would be considered the last bite at the apple. We'd have to move facilities to make that happen, but it is a feasible option. We could also put the waste on rail. That's similar to what the city of Seattle does in Snohomish County as well. That's a feasible option. That would then be exported to an out-of-county landfill. And the third option is to build a waste-to-energy mass burn incinerator and dispose of the waste that way. All 3 of those options work. It's not a question about viability per se, but they have different risks and different complexities associated with them. This is...
Go ahead.
So if Cedar Hills is fully developed again, if Cedar Hills is redeveloped for longer use, what timeline does that entail? Is that another 10 years, another 20 years? with another cell.
At the
you
risk
call
of
it.
sounding like an attorney, it depends, but I'll give you some good planning estimates. So we estimate about 12 years, but it does depend. So in other words, right now our capacity is projected out through 2028. Development options could take that out to the mid-2030s or out to the 2050s. It really depends on a number of factors, both the design options that are available to us, as well as what happens with tonnage, what happens with recycling rates. I will tell you as an aside, 70% of what is sent to the landfill every day doesn't belong there. It's recyclable, right? So as we look at recycling policy, that can have a tremendous impact on the life of a landfill. But that aside, if we assume current recycling rates, we would be extending the life of the landfill through, again, the mid-2030s to as long as the 2050s, depending on those variables.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And it comes at a variety of costs, right? So the numbers that you see on this table, this is a simplified addition to kind of highlight not just the finances, because this is not just a financial decision, but some of the environmental impacts as well as some of the decision risks associated with these options. If you look at just the disposal portion of our costs, right, so that's a portion of the costs, it's projected to be about $41 to develop that additional cell at the landfill. Export, slightly more expensive at about $55, and a waste-to-energy facility about $136 per ton. The reason there's such a dramatic difference, particularly on waste-to-energy, is the capital expense. There's capital expense with all three of these options, but it is more significant in terms of a waste-to-energy facility, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. There's also various ways to measure the environmental implications. There are actually two measures on the slide in front of you. Both of these are from the EPA models. It's what we use to help guide our decision making. One is a life cycle analysis, and the other is more of a annual event-based protocol. But either way, it kind of gives you the relative benefits or costs associated with these disposal options. The reason you'll see that, for instance, under the life cycle analysis for greenhouse gas emissions, the landfilling, perhaps oddly, is removing or has beneficial context with respect to greenhouse gas, particularly at Cedar Hills, is because we're capturing that gas and through a public-private partnership are actually converting it to clean energy. It's going right back into the pipeline, the Puget Sound Energy Pipeline, enough to heat about 19,000 homes every year. So that actually has greenhouse gas removals as a result of that. Now there are an interesting enough, when you think about disposal, I initially didn't think there'd be any impact to recycling. This is just what comes in for disposal. But the reality is there's an advantage to waste energy that is not associated with the other two, and that is the ability to recover recyclables even after it's been incinerated. You're left with ash, and you can sift through that ash using what they call eddy currents or magnetic currents as well, and recover alloys and non-alloy materials, actually boosting the recycling rate. So there are some benefits associated with waste energy that you don't get relative to recycling. There are challenges with all three of these paths, however. Certainly to extend the life of the landfill will entail an environmental review process. We'd have to amend our permits. And while we always have a good neighbor policy, I think it's fair to say our neighbors would be happy to see this facility close. And I think there'd be a challenge associated with extending its life, understandably. The primary concern with respect to export is not the capacity of the landfills that they would go to. It's not even the capacity of rail yards per se, but it is capacity of the rails in between. Already, if you look at whether it's getting the waste into Idaho or southern Washington or northern parts of Oregon, the capacity constraints are already prevalent at certain points along the railway, and projections are that those are going to become more challenging. Now that can get resolved either through adding more rail lines or through pricing mechanisms, but those solutions are not modeled economically here, right? So that's a further challenge that's not reflected. And then really with respect to waste to energy, it's not a technological question. It works, and there's been successful projects of significant scale here in the U.S., most recently in the state of Florida. I think the challenge is both from a siting perspective as well as a sizing perspective. We go back to the context of the tonnage report that I shared with you earlier. In order to have enough capacity for where our region is headed, we would need about a 5,000 ton per day facility. By comparison, today we're at about 2,800 tons per day of waste. So almost twice as large as our current capacity, and a facility that size does not exist anywhere in the world. So we would be in the forefront in terms of sizing a waste energy plant. We wouldn't be alone. I think by that time there are plants being designed in Dubai and China, but it does give you a sense of the curve we would be on in terms of leading the way. So in the executive proposed comprehensive plan, the executive has recommended we proceed with maximizing the life of Cedar Hills, taking advantage of the asset that is already owned within our region. It offers the lowest cost per ton disposal option, the best environmental impacts of the three. It allows us to continue to manage our waste locally, it keeps our jobs local, and is endorsed by both of our advisory committees as well. However, it's important to note that, to Councilmember Pavone's question, it only buys us so much time. And so we do need to consider what will happen after that Cedar Hills capacity, whether it's in 2040 or beyond, is consumed. And so the options are really remaining open to something else, be it waste to energy or waste export or something else that is developed between now and then. The second area that I wanted to cover with you is transfer. And these are really referring again to the transfer stations that we operate that allow your haulers, your collection companies to bring that waste to a local station and get back out on the streets to service the residents and the businesses in your city. The challenge we have is really in the northeast part of our county. The rest of our county has been benefiting from a modernization program, but the northeast kind of remains a questionable station. And quite honestly, to some degree, so does our Renton station, which is a station that is loved by the customers. But in the Northeast, we have a capacity and service equity concern. The station is one of the oldest stations remaining, offers very limited recycling services, and is failing to meet established criteria in terms of both environmental and service elements. I'll describe that in a moment. The Houghton Station is the facility I'm referring to. It's the third busiest in our network of transfer stations, and that's third busiest whether you're measuring it by tonnage or by customer traffic. And yet, those red lines depict the fact that it fails to meet its ability to handle tonnage or transactional demand. The recycling is so limited there. In fact, the previous slide I showed you, I'll put it back up there real quick, it's the third busiest, but it recycles the least of all of our stations that offer recycling. So it really fails to meet the established criteria for our services. And quite honestly, the constituents in that area are paying the same amount as everyone else in our system who are benefiting from a modern system, a modern station that offers an enclosed facility, modern advanced environmental controls that allow us to mitigate and minimize the impacts of the community around it while providing a first-rate level of service. So within that, the executive has proposed that we proceed with siting and building a new Northeast station to replace Houghton and resolve that inequity. It is not the least expensive option, right? Because as I mentioned, even with landfilling, it's not a financial decision by itself, although that certainly matters. But it does address both the inequities and the interests of the system as a whole. And it's consistent with the long-range plan for its replacement that has really been in place for decades at this stage. The last area I'd like to cover with you quickly is also very important, though, and it's really recycling. And I alluded to you earlier that 70% of what's getting disposed of each day really should be recycled. But the challenge is, depending on where you live, work, and play here in King County, it's very confusing on how to recycle. I think that we have a lot of people who want to recycle, and they try to recycle, but how you recycle in Renton is different than how you recycle in unincorporated or even in Seattle, right? It's confusing, and that's breeding contamination, and that contamination then devalues the resource. And so really the opportunity is to take a unified approach and eliminate that confusion and that variability across the county and have one way to recycle, and we refer to it as responsible recycling. It's been a long time since we've tried to take that kind of unified approach, and I speak from the county as well as on behalf of the cities that we all have unique needs and ideas of what's best, and so I think with all good intentions, we've created recycling programs to try and cater to the needs and interests of our communities, but it's created these regional differences that are becoming problematic. But I look back in time, and back into the early 90s, we had a similar situation where recycling rates were remarkably low, 19% on average, because we were all doing it very, very differently as well. And the region got together and said, well, what if we had what we call this commingled can, right? Single stream resources, or single stream recycling. Instead of having multiple bins for everything, what if we just put everything in one bin? And that was a big change for the region, right? Where we kind of abandoned our individual ways of doing things and took a regional harmonized approach to recycling. And what happened within 5 years is that recycling rates doubled, right? So to me, when I stumbled across this data, because I wasn't around here at the time, it was a great reminder that we actually can think and act as kind of one unit in this regional area for the benefit of the environment and our goals in that regard. So I think it's some exciting opportunities ahead. I'll share with you, because you may have heard about the China sword, and there's certainly reason to be concerned about China's policy in terms of what they're now buying and importing in terms of our recycling markets, because we have relied upon them for many, many years. The important context for you to know is that China's policy, where they have enforced bans on certain materials, does not affect 85% of our recycled tonnage, right? It does affect an important part, about 15% or 14% by this slide, and that's certainly impactful and something we need to manage. But I want you to share the word, keep recycling, right? We should not let off on the gas on recycling, despite the differences in how China's pursuing their own recycling policies, because most of our tonnage is not impacted by that. The message that we're encouraging you to share with your constituents is keep recycling, but keep it empty, clean, and dry. And if you can keep it empty, clean, and dry, it's going to go a long ways to resolving the contamination, which is really a core problem, not just for China, but for the world in dealing with these recycled materials. The last slide I'll share with you is a general timeline for this comprehensive plan. We are nearing the end, and this is a milestone that has been in the works for many, many years, but intensely for the last 2 years we've been working with our cities in partnership, as well as with our regional businesses out there. And I have to just pause to let you know that we have appreciated the leadership that your own staff have provided, both Greg Zimmerman and Linda Knight specifically. Linda serves in a leadership position on one of our advisory committees, and so for many years we have benefited from active participation by your city in the development of this plan and many other important works. And we're now at a stage where our county council is considering adoption of this plan. That's the first part of the adoption process, and it's an important part. And in fact, it's an opportunity for you to speak out and share with our county council your thoughts of this plan. Now, of course, I hope that you find this plan to be well aligned with your own interests and values. But either way, I would encourage you to consider a letter to our council expressing your views, because they are on October 1st going to pick this up in their committee of the whole and begin to evaluate this plan and its content. So it's an important opportunity for your city to be an influencer in that process. And I will share with you, other cities have taken advantage of this to send a letter of their expressing their relative interest and positions on that. But that's the first part of the adoption process. The second and essential part is the city adoption process, which happens afterwards. Now, we hope that we'll get through the county adoption process this year, and that's going to be a challenge, but we're working hard to make that happen. There's a lot of momentum behind this plan, and I think that's helping towards that goal. And should we be successful in that, we would anticipate that in early 2019, it will then be turned over to the cities for action. And that will be your opportunity, beyond any letter that you might send now, it will be your opportunity to take a formal position on the plan. And what I want you to know is the adoption process, as spelled out in our interlocal agreements, says that once our county council has adopted the plan, that a time clock begins to tick. And it's a 120-day time clock. And during that period of time, cities who take action, either for or against, but they take, I believe it's in the form of a city resolution, and they take action, will determine whether or not the plan is ultimately adopted, right? So it'll be important for your city to consider taking action during that 120-day period, especially a city of your size, because it's the ultimate decision is based on the populations that are represented by those cities taking action. So we'll remind you of that process and when that time clock begins, but we're hoping that's in early 2019. And in the meantime, we hope that through this briefing or any additional information we can provide, you'll be comfortable in sharing a letter of, I'll say, support in hopes of such with our council. But I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have, either on things I spoke about or perhaps things I didn't mention. And I appreciate, again, the opportunity to be here before you this evening.
Any questions from council?
Mr. President,
Yes.
thank you so much. It was a great presentation. Thank you for being here. And I already toured the Cedar Hills, and I was really impressed, I may say. So for the benefit of those whose English is their second language, I want to clarify that if I understood correctly, you said that we should spread the word that keep recycling is the way to go. But you say empty, clean, and dried. Empty meaning that the container should be completely empty. Am I
Yes, ma'am.
interpreting this correctly?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. Corbin.
Yeah, so just a couple quick things. One is I remember discussions community-wide with solid waste regarding waste to energy like 25 years ago or something. I think at that time there was an increment added to the collection costs. Like a team was kind of going forward with researching the waste to energy. And boy, do I remember blowback from the community on that. And I know you mentioned that when you said siting was the big issue. Boy, I remember just getting an earful from everybody concerned about airborne contamination, and there was no amount of scientific research that was going to satisfy a certain part of the population. I remember, so I just want to say that I wouldn't be eager to step into the middle of that again if we don't have to. So that was one of the things. The other thing I was going to say is, you know, our part of our issue, and this is really something I think Renton could just work with our waste hauler, but I think we still have opportunity where we do apartments, any commercial. I'm not sure we're still collecting all the recycling separately that we could. And I think that's something we should take up here. We have a lot of apartments that have single dumpster, and I think the residential, I mean, seems like me and my neighbors are trying really hard at our homes to sort the stuff, but I think that's where and the number 70% is really interesting. So 70% of the landfill is still recycling, and we really should work hard on that collectively. And thank you for the presentation.
You're welcome.
Go ahead.
Thank you again. I enjoyed your presentation. I really think that the hauling to Oregon, Idaho, whoever will take it by rail is most likely more risky, in my personal opinion, because somebody down there could shut us off, and then what do we do? I mean, I think we need to look at controlling our own destiny. So I would, I agree with Randy on the burning of it, or whatever you want to call it. Somewhere down the line, we have to have some place and some way to take care of it. The Cedar River is just a short-term gap. I most likely won't be around here in 2040, but for my kids and grandkids and that, we have to do that. And then again, the recycling. I have a summer place over in Pend Oreille County. We would love to recycle. Nobody will take recycling. I mean, that's just, they look at you like you're nuts.
Yeah.
Here, it is a thing to do, and I encourage, we have not slowed down on our recycling.
Thank you.
But I agree with Randy, is that we get like apartment places and condos that would like to, but for some reason we can't get our waste haulers to do it. So we should maybe take a look at that. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so on the clean and dry, and what was the other?
Empty.
Empty. So what level do you go? I mean, is it like washing a dish? It has to be, you're gonna put it in your cupboard clean? I mean, it's so subjective, right?
Yeah, it doesn't need to be sanitary clean, but it should be, if it's a yogurt container, they don't want to see yogurt in the container. Because what happens is that it doesn't stay in the container, right? It gets all over the cardboard, right? Or it gets over on the paper, or whatever it is. It doesn't stay in its container by the time it's handled and processed. It becomes quite messy. And it can, so it's not just about the contamination of the product that it's maybe in, it's how it contaminates everything else in that bin. And that's why it's, being dry is also important, because the water, over time, and especially if there's significant portions of it, can then create mildew, and be, further a challenge.
Thank you, that was helpful.
That is helpful.
Mr. McGurven.
Thank you. So I'd like to think that everyone would be very earth conscious about doing that and would go to that extra effort, but I recall the reason we ended up with a single bin is because people were not separating them in the first place. Might it be better that the solution, if it's cross-contamination, to look again at having people separate? I'm wondering if people would be more likely to put it in a different bin than they would be to go through the effort of cleaning it to the level it would need to be.
Yeah, it's a classic argument, because you're right that there was a benefit, I think, that we lost when we went from the multiple bins to the single bin, and that was, you had to think and you had to be conscious about, what belonged where. I still think there was a risk of it being dirty back then, but so somehow we have to. I think that we could go back the other way, but the other thing we've learned is that there are safety issues with that there's safety and environmental issues with going back to multiple bins. Think about the number of trucks that have to come back through your neighborhoods to pick up those multiple bins, right? And also, it could also, it certainly did back then, mean a lot more of the drivers having to get out of the truck to deal with those bins. And that's dangerous, right? It's a very hazardous job that they have, a very difficult job. And so a lot of studies have suggested that it's a difficult and challenging and even risky proposition to go back, but it is a choice that could be done.
Go ahead.
I like your idea, but the other ones, when we did the separate ones, were so small that it became actually easier to put stuff in the garbage can than it
You run out
did.
of room and you throw it in the garbage can.
Yeah, and we do rinse out our yogurt cans, and I take and shake the bottles and get, but they don't want the lid on them, right? It seems to me if I shake the bottle out,
Are you talking about, like a water
plastic,
bottle?
yeah.
You know, you can keep the lid on, it's okay.
Okay,
But-
because I was told not to do that. And
Yeah.
that would keep
And there
things
might be
dry.
conflicting direction there, but here, the other invitation I will throw out to you, and I think it's yet another reason why going back to the multi-bins is probably not a great idea, at least for this region, is that our private partners have made a significant investment and have successfully developed sorting technologies. So we have these material recovery facilities that take that single bin, and with the a combination of both people and technology, are able to highly effectively sort through those resources. But again, if they're dirty, they're not running a big dishwasher there, so they really count on clean product.
Real quick follow.
Quick.
Oh, I just want to say, I by no means want to advocate. I love the single bin, and would never advocate the other way. My question is whether or not people would actually go through the effort to do it. If we don't see the reductions in contamination, what is the alternative? That was all. So, that's it.
And I promised to drain all my wine bottles before I throw them in.
Yeah, we don't see, that's not been a problem, yeah.
And on that note, we are going to move on. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much, appreciate your time this evening.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, anyone have any regional issues?
I thought we threw, no.
So I will mention for your perusal, we didn't get all of the Affordable Housing Task Force document loaded onto the iPad, so I will make sure that you guys get all of that. SCA has their draft legislative agenda out, and there's one item I'm going to mention to them when I see them, since I'm not on the legislative committee. There had been talk about putting the state crime lab on here as a priority issue. And so I'm going to have a conversation with Deanna about making sure that that gets listed.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
I said there was a conversation about adding the state crime lab and the issues around the state crime lab onto the SCA legislative agenda.
Okay.
It didn't make it onto the draft agenda, so I am going to have a conversation with the folks at SCA to make sure it makes it on there, because it's a priority.
Thank you.
Is there anything you want to say about the Affordable Housing Task Force?
Sure, thank you. I would just add, so our September meeting, which would have occurred last Friday, was canceled. I imagine that's so there's a little bit more time for SCA to take a look, get a little bit more stakeholder input. We're working on scheduling the final 3 meetings to occur in October, November, and December. This will also kind of align the final product of the Affordable Housing Task Force with the recommendation produced by one table, since there will be a little bit of overlap in terms of how much affordable housing we're funding. I think it would make sense for the two to work in concert. So whatever they produce or do not produce, obviously, will have an impact on what the Affordable Housing Task Force decides. The issues I would ask council members to look at would certainly be the governance structure that's being proposed, whether it's more of an interlocal agreement or whether it's more of another regional authority like Sound Transit with taxing authority potentially, which follows the second point. There will be a funding component of some level likely to this plan in order to fund the affordable housing that we'd be building. So those would be the portions of the recommendations I certainly would value your input on. So rather than go through the entire document, because it is a little bit lengthy, I'll let you review that and get back to me.
All right, please.
Yep, I guess I will just do a quick report on, there's a BRT elected officials group that I've been representing Renton on, and we met 10 days ago or something like that. And I just wanted to share that there's been a real consensus up and down the corridor of all the concerns that I've gone in with that we've collectively had, the other cities have brought forward. But I do want to commend Sound Transit. They are, it seemed like during, a year ago, they were backing away a little bit from some of the expectations of bus rapid transit. It seemed like, I felt like a year ago they were starting to talk about just express bus service. They're back to understanding that we want level loading vehicles. We want vehicles that have multiple doors. We want people to have prepaid. We want 1 minute turn times. They're going a step further, and they're looking at branding the buses, making sure the stations are really clearly defined, and the stations are a special place where you know that you're getting on the BRT. So all those elements are coming together. I was impressed the state DOT is working hard with the Sound Transit to try and, like we saw the video of the roundabouts and everything at Exit 7.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, seems like some really good design work. I've still, continue to always have concerns, and of course, I think every one of us is being watchful that, recognizing this is, so far in Sound Transit 3, this is the biggest issue, the biggest thing that Renton's getting out of that, so we want it to come out really well. I'll say one other thing is, I'm actually co-chairing that committee, and I had brought up that I wanted to have some sort of a parking lot place that we could keep, as elected officials, keep ideas about what the preferred spots for future stations. And I've reminded the rest of the group that part of the point of BRT is you shouldn't be as stuck with your stations as you are with the rail. I mean, that's the part of the purpose of having it on rubber tires. And so everybody agreed that was a good idea to at least kind of start notionally having an idea of where future stations might go in, and then I threw on the board, the first one on there that we'd want something down around Boeing and the landing and Southport, because that came out of our transportation summit. So, and people agreed that that's, there's no funding for that yet, but that's sort of notionally where we're going. And so if you have any other inputs for me or for that team, you can either provide them to me or directly. Thanks.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Randy.
All right, we are adjourned. We will reconvene at 7 o'clock as a full council.